John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is one of America's most infamous criminal cases. He's practically single-handedly responsible for traumatizing an entire generation into a fear of clowns. A vicious sadist and a remorseless criminal, hearing clips of him talk is deeply disturbing. In a series of interviews in 1992, Mr. Gacy offered a rare window into the mind of a lunatic. In the interviews, Gacy is adamant that he is innocent of his crimes, and talks in a remarkably pleasant, almost affable way. He seems like an average Joe, a chatty old man that you would probably talk to at a park or something, until little cracks in the facade keep appearing and its darkness comes out. He appears to be talking himself in circles. At one point, it seems like he indirectly confesses to something he claimed that he hadn't, and when the interviewer presses him on it, he retracts like a child being caught in a lie, saying, "I'm sorry if I led you to believe that." In the same interview, the reporter asks Gacy to show him the rope trick, the horrifying method of strangulation Gacy would use on his victims by applying a tourniquet. Gacy obliges, but when the reporter hands him the string, he chuckles wryly and says, "Aren't you scared sitting next to me?" Most chilling is when the subject changes to talk of his clowning. He seems like he genuinely loved it, and knowing the unspeakable acts he committed as a clown makes it all the more sinister. He talks about how to him, clowning was an act of regression. It allowed him to explore his inner child within. Deeply, deeply unsettling. Perhaps most upsetting, though, is hearing Gacy talk about his anger towards his victim's family, saying they're overreacting. And you realize everything about the persona you've seen in the interviews is all just an act, just more makeup. My ghouls and goblins, if you're enjoying what we do on the channel and you want to hear more true crime stories, then subscribe to Top 5 Scared. We've got stuff coming every day. Number 4. The Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez terrorized Los Angeles for 14 months between 1984 and 1985. But perhaps you know him better under the sobriquet The Night Stalker. Maybe you saw the Netflix documentary that came out a bit recently. He was named that due to his propensity to seek into people's houses undetected and then carry out his sickening crimes. Eventually, he was caught after a facial sketch made newspaper front pages, leading to him being apprehended by an angry mob and arrested. He didn't see many interviews or too much direct media attention, but one that was filmed prior to his final sentencing showcases his twisted nature and the utter remorselessness of someone who was called the Night Stalker. While being asked about the nature of his crimes and the horrific dealings of them, Ramirez appears amused, smiling, almost holding back laughter. When asked outright about his motives, he smirks as if he's holding in a secret. It gets worse when he starts to wax poetic and philosophize about human nature. He chuckles a bit when asked if he thinks of himself as evil and says, "We're all evil." He insists that what he did is no different than what governments do on a large scale. He claims, saying he is merely a product of his time and that he was living in bloodthirsty times. Every word hangs in the air uncomfortably. He denies to answer if he feels emotions. He says he gave up on the feeling of love and happiness long before his crime spree started. But everything he says seems very fake and self-serving. The interviewer even notes this, saying, "You do a very good job reading off the script, Richard." There's an appearance of gloating as he talks as well. He expresses that he felt he would be crushed by his own desires if he didn't act on them. And when asked if he's afraid, he says he doesn't care what happens to him, and he never did. Truly sombering. Number 3. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy has fascinated people for years, due in large part to how well he was able to disguise himself and make himself appear normal. But underneath his carefully put together persona was one of the darkest, most truly vile criminals the United States had ever seen. Unlike most serial offenders, Bundy not only kept up appearances, but was well-groomed, charming, charismatic, and had a very compelling way with words, able to manipulate people scarily efficiently. He came from a happy family, a good Christian household, and didn't seem to fit the usual bill for these sort of criminals. The last interview ever conducted with him highlights a lot of these traits. He appears very soft-spoken, speaking quietly and almost soothingly to the camera, doing his best to garner sympathy from the audience and the interviewer. He attempts to blame a lot of his violence, darkness, and misdeeds on an addiction to lewd content. When he's describing it, he almost sounds like a man trying to talk about kicking caffeine, saying, "Oh, I think I'd be a lot better without it." Not just for him, but for lots of other people. When he says that phrase, he pauses a bit and gives a dark, knowing look to the interviewer. He's even joking around a bit, playfully. He comes across as very intelligent, answering all of the questions thoughtfully, but everything about it just seems terrifying, especially knowing the grisly nature of the things he did. But it feels like you're listening to a mask talk. It helps you understand how he was able to commit so much of what he did the way you hear him talk. When asked directly if he thinks he deserves his punishment, he answers eloquently, saying he's afraid to die, but he feels that he deserves to be punished to the most extreme extent of the law, and that society will be better off without dangers like him. It is a frigid look into the mind of someone so twisted. Number 2. Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer is infamous. The name immediately evokes horrible emotions. Perhaps you've seen one of the many movies based on his twisted crimes, but the truth is always scarier. In 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer would give his last interview before his final sentencing, speaking to Stone Phillips, a former NBC anchor. The interview featured his father Lionel present, who Dahmer did not share a close relationship with. Now, the entire extended segment is harrowing. Dahmer is completely cold and calculating the entire time, speaking dryly with almost no emotion to anything he's saying. It's as fascinating as it is horrifying to hear him talk, to be honest. He remembers everything very clearly, and he describes it plainly, matter of fact, extremely sterilely. But there is a hint of remorse, almost regret over what he's done, but it is impossible to tell truly if it's genuine sincerity or if it's all just a carefully manipulated act to appear sympathetic. Perhaps the most disturbing insight into Dahmer's brain is when he tells the reporter that he found the violent acts of his crimes distasteful, and said that it was all just a means to an end of his ultimate goal, which was having complete physical domination over someone else. He describes his crimes as not something I enjoyed doing, and then proceeds to explain his sinister desire to create living zombies by putting acid in brains, leaving people docile and helpless. Dahmer was known as well to keep trophies of his victims, calling into question if any of these statements rang true. He reiterates that he just wanted someone to keep under his complete control, a slave to his will. And number 1. Charles Manson. Charles Manson may very well be the most notoriously well-known criminal in American history. He's definitely the most well-known cult leader. The cult leader led a string of violent attacks in 1969 to 1971 that would eventually culminate in his arrest and standing trial for his grievous crimes. Manson would spend the rest of his life in jail and occasionally entertained interviewers looking to shed light on the bizarre, grisly story. Manson was charismatic in his own way, persuasive, outrageous, and most importantly, commanding and controlling. But if you ever saw any of his interviews after his arrest, you'd be forgiven for not thinking that, since pretty much every time he opens his mouth, it's either to share his bleak, nihilistic worldview, or raving in a way that is just completely incomprehensible and is the gibbering of a madman. As soon as this one interview starts, he boasts that he doesn't feel guilty since he hasn't done anything he's ashamed of, and then pausing for a second and clarifying, "I'm ashamed of not doing enough." From there, he then starts speaking complete gibberish and then elaborating a bit on some of the conditions that made him this way. He talks about growing up without parents, which left him feeling like he was in a different dimension, saying that it's hard for him to think about things clearly, saying he hardly remembers breakfast. Watching Manson talk is a fascinating study. He almost seems fictional, a larger-than-life personality ripped out of a comic book film in it, but he's real. And the real darkness behind his eyes is a harrowing reminder of what can lie inside someone. Most of the interviews with Manson are like this. Ravings, rantings, a stream of vile hatred and aggression, and a peek into the minds of one of the most twisted men to ever live. Grigory Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, was a mystical healer who wandered Russia in the early 20th century. Now, I could do a plot summary of what Rasputin got up to, but honestly, Boney M did a better job than I ever will, so just alt-tab out of this video real quick, listen to that song, come on back. Okay. Did you? Well, if you didn't, the quick rundown is that the black monk genuinely believed himself to be a holy healer with otherworldly powers, and was appointed a lofty position by Tsarina Alexandra to heal the young prince of his hemophilia. He was rumored to be part of a secret order called Klisti, connected with all sorts of scandalous practices. Now, no official connection was ever made to Rasputin and the sect. Rumors of the man still persisted. He carried an infamous reputation around the country, with stories of his wild debauchery and black magic, stories of wild powers. Did he really have otherworldly powers? Given his infamous nigh immortality, I am a bit inclined to agree with him. The man simply could not be put down without serious effort. There was a plot to have him enticed by a courtesan and castrated until he caught wind of it. In 1914, he was in the chest by a beggar and shrugged it off like it was nothing. Now, of course, the most famous story of Rasputin was his assassination at the hands of the Tsar's cousin and a handful of noblemen. As the famous legend goes, he was poisoned, bludgeoned, and drowned, and still that wasn't enough until he passed later in the day. Was Rasputin just Russia's toughest customer, built different? Or did he have some sort of mystical help from another world? We may never know. And are we having fun with the channel, my little freaks and creeps? Stay subscribed for more scary content every single day. Number 4. Vlad the Impaler. You know, with a title like Vlad the Impaler, it's safe to assume that the guy was probably up to no good, demon or no demon. Perhaps you've heard the legend that Vlad Tepes was the inspiration for Count Dracula, which should tell you even more if you want to judge of this guy's moral character. Vlad was a prince of Wallachia, an area that's now known as modern Romania. Vlad grew up in a very dark period of Wallachian history, coming up while the Ottoman Empire was setting its sights on just about everything good in Eastern Europe. Vlad was made king of Wallachia, but first he was deposed and exiled after an assassination plot on his brother and father. He would reclaim the throne in 1458 and quickly began a campaign of bloodlust to show the world he was not someone you should be messing with. One of his most infamous acts, and where the dubious title comes from, was after fending off an Ottoman invasion, he impaled 20,000 soldiers and left them as a grim forest of the damned. And some legends say he would eat dinner in front of this. Downright demonic behavior. There's some debate as to whether or not he really is the inspiration for Dracula, although of note is that beside his infamous sobriquet Vlad the Impaler, he went by the nickname Vlad Dracul, owning from his father's position in the Order of the Dragon, which translated to Dracul. There are also stories of Vlad washing his hands with the blood of his enemies, which I'm gonna be honest, that kind of sounds like something Dracula would do. It's worth noting too, no one really knows what happened to Vlad's body. We know that he was slain in battle, and that he was eventually put down after years of carnage, but his body or grave has never been found. Perhaps it's because it's still walking, or flapping. Whatever a bat does. Number 3. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of history's most infamous criminals, and honestly, maybe the most. Over 130 years ago, and we are still absolutely fascinated by his crimes, and we still don't even know for certain who he was. Could still be out there, he could still be at large. He terrorized Whitechapel through the year of 1888, leaving behind a series of sickeningly grisly crime scenes, torn apart and left in the street for all to see. There are at least 5 confirmed cases that are attributed to Jack the Ripper, but there are several more that are speculated to be attached to him, with some suggesting that it could be anywhere from 13 or higher. Jack eluded capture, stupefied his pursuers, and taunted his would-be captors, sending the police souvenirs, I guess, from his crimes, wrapping in the mail and sending them out. On one occasion, he did this alongside a threatening letter, boldly claiming to be from hell, known as the From Hell letter. The jeering letter taunted the police, inviting them to catch him, while he described the pleasure he took in his sick, sordid dealings. Investigators were downright stumped trying to find the guy. They suspected he didn't have any level of medical training, as his hurried slashes led them to believe he could have been a butcher. The way he slashed his victims was beyond horrific. He left them missing and in some cases beyond recognition. It seemed too like he could be in multiple places at once. A body discovered in New York a few years after the crime spree matched the victims of Whitechapel almost perfectly. Was it a human performing all these sickening acts? Or could the Ripper's mangling be attributed to a demon that was preying on the women of White Castle? It would explain how he was so elusive and managed to evade capture for all those years. Number 2. Emperor Nero. Now perhaps you've heard of Emperor Nero. You've probably heard the story of him playing the fiddle as Rome burned around him. But honestly, historically, that barely even cracks the top 5 craziest things Nero ever accomplished in his tenure as emperor. Nero set a new standard for wildness as a world leader that I think has never been matched again. Where do I begin with him? Let's start off small. He had a dedicated legion of soldiers, referred to as the Augustans, whose sole function was to follow him around and clap and hype him up whenever he would perform. Now that's kind of harmlessly crazy. So what about the story that Nero used to use his enemies as torches for his gardens? Yeah, Nero had a passionate hatred for Christians, blaming them for the infamous fire that engulfed Rome, which some historians believe Nero himself started. That's pretty wild. But what about the fact that Nero would dress himself in the skins of animals with his romantic partners? Or about how he orchestrated the deaths of his mother and brother? Nero ensured his own position as Emperor of Rome. Emperor Claudius married Nero's mother Agrippina, who then adopted Nero as his own son. When Agrippina poisoned Claudius, Nero took the throne, and then to ensure that he could keep that position on that lofty chair, he poisoned his stepbrother and would later poison his own mother to make sure no one could challenge him as emperor. He then enjoyed all the pleasures of Rome as much as he could. He depleted the treasury of Rome at one point solely to make a statue of himself in his own honor, the Colossus of Nero, to leave a lasting legacy. In the end, after years of insanity, Nero took his own life by ordering one of his own servants to stab him after being told he would be executed by the state as he was considered an enemy of Rome. He bemoaned what an artist the world was losing. Nero's proclivity for wild debauchery, outrageous pursuits of pleasure, intense wanton cruelty, and violence towards Christians led some people at the time to view Nero as the Antichrist himself. And to be honest, I get it. Number 1. Manson. Charles Manson. The most infamous cult leader in history. And he might very well be one of the most famous criminals of all time. Charles Manson had a hypnotic level of control over his devout followers, leading them to a dark crime spree that would claim the lives of 35 people. Now, Manson himself never raised a blade to anyone that we know of, but rather used his domineering charisma to orchestrate the slayings down to the littlest details. He had a grim vision of an apocalypse where he believed there was going to be a race war and that his family needed to prepare for this. And part of these preparations was bumping off key celebrities he had a list of. Manson had dominion over his followers, giving them sacrament every day when in reality he was just giving them illegal substances to keep them impressionable. He banned glasses, calendars, watches, clocks, and anything that would ground them to the real world and made them more malleable to his will. Now, Manson and his family are host to a number of conspiracy theories. There's a very popular one saying that Manson himself is a product of the CIA's MK Ultra brainwashing program, and this is why he was so effective at controlling other people, and that the whole Manson family cult was a CIA op to destabilize the hippie movement. But another very prevailing theory is that the Manson family were Satanists, and they were part of a nationwide cabal connected with other dark crimes around the same time, like the Son of Sam. Manson's obsession with evil, his dark dealings, and complete control over his subjects do make him seem a bit like a modern-day Lucifer. Could Manson have had a supernatural level of control over people?
Bundy, Greenawalt, and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The 2 men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers and Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades on death row. Number 4. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lyda Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lyda married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lyda was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lyda a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meyer, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lyda. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lyda was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bed sheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief. Number 3. Nikolai Zhumagaliev, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet Army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year, whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later, and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he had invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him, but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least 1 more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities before decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had based on witness statements to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their number 1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison, where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison, where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini, and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian, looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them, not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to begin calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force, who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old, after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.
5. Robert Fisher. Robert Fisher was a man living in Arizona with his wife and 2 children, living quietly. He had worked as a surgical technician and had previously attempted to become a Navy SEAL. He was an avid outdoorsman, an expert hunter, angler, and camper, and found himself frustrated that his children didn't quite share this love of the outdoors with him. Fisher did all he could to present himself as an all-American, white picket fence, nuclear family man, but the truth was far more complicated than that. A child of divorce, Fisher had intense issues regarding separation. He and his wife fought constantly over everything, and reports from friends say that he was cruel, controlling, and manipulative to her during their marriage, refusing to let her decorate the house how she wanted, berating her constantly, and so forth. As well, he didn't socialize much outside of his family and was described as a loner. In late 2001, his wife Mary Fisher had had enough, and after nearly 20 years of marriage, was planning on filing for a divorce. On April 9th, 2001, neighbors would overhear a loud argument from the Fisher property. Later that night, the property would explode, burst into flames. Firefighters found inside the property the bodies of Mary Fisher alongside the Fisher son and daughter. Mary had been and the other victims slashed. Robert Fisher himself was not recovered at the site. Robert was thought to have set off the explosion in his own home intentionally as a way of burying his evidence and his tracks, and is thought to have fled entirely, hoping to begin again under a new identity. The thought process from police being he was terrified of Mary leaving him and afraid of repeating the childhood trauma of his mother's divorce. He saw fit to end the lives of his family rather than put them through that experience. Now, friends of Fisher had noted that there had actually been a pattern of worrying behavior before this. Allegedly, on one hunting trip after successfully bagging an elk, Fisher took the blood from the exit wound and smeared it all over his face. Another occasion describes him sneaking up on a family at a picnic to scare them by firing off shotgun rounds into the air, or an altercation in which he fatally a neighborhood dog for attacking his dog, although the police had suspected there was foul play. Fisher was never found, and police aren't even sure if he's still alive. One detective working the case said, "Maybe this is all we'll ever get. Maybe this is the best we've got, knowing he did it and never finding him again." And my ghouls and goblins, if it's scary stuff you're looking for, Top 5 Scary's gotta be one of the top 5 best places to watch scary videos. Ghosts, cryptids, real crimes, aliens, we got it all. Take a look through the cursed archives and see where it takes you. Now let's keep going. Number 4. Richard Lynn Bear. Richard Lynn Bear is an interesting exception on this list, as he's the only one of these fugitives who actually was caught. Now the problem with this is that he was not caught for very long. Didn't really take, as he escaped from jail shortly after being apprehended. Richard was wanted for the death of Sherry Hart, a divorcee and young mother who was waiting for a date on January 15th, 1984. Her date had stood her up, and she changed her evening plans to go out and have fun with high school friends Jeffrey Burgess and one Richard Lynn Bear. However, the evening would take an extremely dark turn when Bear would make an advance at Sherry Hart. She rebuked him, and infuriated and incensed, Richard bashed her with the butt of a handgun and ordered that Burgess drive them about an hour and a half away into the woods. Lynn Bear then dumped Sherry out of the vehicle in the woods, leaving her bleeding heavily. Burgess had told police he'd acted under the threat of his life, as Bear had told him he would see to it that Burgess died if he said anything about what had happened that night. However, Burgess was more than willing to cooperate with the police, leading them to finding Hart's remains and arresting both Bear and Burgess for the crime. However, Burgess would escape days before being tried from the small-town county jail, where he fled, adding him to the FBI's most wanted list for his crimes and unlawful flight to avoid persecution. As of this recording, the trail had gone completely cold, and Lynn Bear was never found again and is still wanted. Burgess passed away at the age of 46, having spent most of his life in and out of prison on various unrelated charges. Number 3. Bradford Bishop. Until I can prove that he's dead, I'm going to assume he's still alive. That's the words of Montgomery County Sheriff Raymond Knight, speaking on our next entry, Bradford Bishop. This notorious criminal has been on the FBI's most wanted list for years, and has managed to elude capture this entire time. In fact, he was taken off of the FBI's most wanted list in late 2018 to accommodate more serious fugitives, and FBI had some reason to believe he might not even still be alive. Bradford Bishop was an unusual case, as he was a fairly promising career man with no stains on his record. He was working as a counterintelligence official, a former army serviceman, and he worked as a diplomat. Life seemed to be going fairly well for Mr. Bishop, who fathered 3 children with his wife Annette, where they lived in Bethesda, Maryland. On March 1st, 1976, Bradford was passed over for a promotion at work that he was due for. He left the office a little bit early, telling his secretary he wasn't feeling well that day. He would then drive to his bank, he withdrew a large amount of money, and he went to fill up gas in his car, and then to a hardware store to purchase a shovel, pitchfork, and a sledgehammer. Bradford would then return home and ended the lives of his family members one by one. He would carry their bodies into the trunk of his car, where he drove them deep into the swamp nearly 300 miles away, where he buried and lit the bodies ablaze in a shallow grave, burning the remains of his once happy family. There would be a few sightings of Bradford afterwards. He was last seen buying tennis shoes with an unknown woman and a dog March 2nd. On March 18th, his car was discovered by police at an isolated campground all the way over in Tennessee. The contents of the car were unnerving. A blood-soaked blanket, a shotgun, an axe, and the well for the spare tire was soaked in blood. A jury indicted Bradford, and that was the last time any evidence of the case ever emerged. Now, since then, there have been numerous unproven sightings, sporadically appearing throughout Europe mostly, but nothing that has contributed to an arrest. If Bradford Bishop is still alive, he is 86 and has still evaded capture. Number 2. The Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom was the self-given nickname of a serial criminal around Washington, D.C. who has never been identified. He first made himself known in the early 1970s, seemingly taking a page out of the Zodiac's coded puzzling handbook. The Freeway Phantom taunted the police with cryptic messages and puzzles teasing his capture. 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard was found dead in November 1971 with a note inside one of her coat pockets. The note read out as follows: "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Signed, the Freeway Phantom." The name happened to catch on. There are few criminals who offer to write their own monikers, but clearly the Freeway Phantom had a brand in mind. Over the course of a 17-month period, 6 similarly aged young black women were found all along the highway, all missing their shoes and all showing visible signs of trauma. Police had been working on what they thought had been promising leads, including an investigation into 2 former police officers who were being convicted of a separate crime. However, none of these investigations ever turned up anything concrete, leading the FBI to take charge of the case in 1974. However, it was around this time that the trail started to go cold, and no more deaths following the Freeway Phantom's MO appeared, luckily. Although tragically for the victims' families, no justice would ever be found either. The investigation is still active in some aspects in Washington, D.C., although, given that it's been 5 decades since the first victim was found, it's hard to think that any serious progress might be made on this case. Perhaps the identity of the Freeway Phantom will never come to light, but at the very least, it seems as if the brutal series of crimes had stopped. Number 1. The vending machine. When you were younger, did you ever hear about the urban legend of someone putting poison in candy, or someone putting a razor blade inside of a chocolate or an apple or something and giving it out to trick-or-treaters? Probably have. I mean, I've even talked about it before in a previous video on urban legends. It's the kind of story that you'd hear on a playground and it would scare you and stick with you for life. You tell yourself that kind of thing only happens in the movies, and no one in their right mind would ever go around poisoning unsuspecting people. But that's perhaps because you've never heard of this case. The case of the mysterious vending machine criminal in Japan. This wave started in April of 1985. People around Western Japan, primarily in Tokyo, were dying under mysterious circumstances. The first victim died shortly after purchasing 2 bottles of a popular Japanese soda, Orinamen C. In the next coming weeks, there were 35 cases of mysterious poisonings, all tracked back to Orinamen C purchased at vending machines. At the time of the crime spree, the company producing Orinamen C had been running a promotion where their vending machines would give out a second bottle of the product after purchasing one, and the criminal took advantage of this fact, lacing bottles of the soft drink with a powerful poison, and he placed them inside or on top of the vending machines to deceive consumers into believing that they'd been a winner of the promotion and they got that extra second bottle. Shortly after, police issued city-wide warnings across all vending machines to inspect each drink carefully to see if the seal on the bottle cap had been tampered. Of these 35 cases, 12 of them were fatal, making the Orinamen C tampering the deadliest product tampering case in history. Police had absolutely 0 leads, and the nature of the crime made it incredibly difficult to track down, as the bottles had been dispersed seemingly randomly across Western Japan. As well, there did not appear to be any greater motive, no intentional victims. There was nothing to link them together, as the victims that had all been afflicted had been completely random. Police had suggested, though, that they think the suspect was a single agent acting alone, who had meticulously planned the crime. A psychologist suggested possibly that the crime was carried out as a response to Japan's orderly and aggressive work culture, and that this was a lashing out by hurting unsuspecting people that the victim would never have to face. They would get a sense of rush and control, but never have to directly deal with the consequences. Whoever was behind the Orinamen C tampering spree was never caught. There were cases across Tokyo afterwards police suspected might have been copycats, but no leads and no arrests were ever made.